Hello there. I'm your imaginary friend. We're going to see how much farther we can get through the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Now, yeah, there's going to be more of that racism we've sadly come to learn to be prepared for in works of this era. So yeah, do be prepared for that. There's going to be more of it. Chapter 20. The chief was as good as his word, and we were soon plentifully supplied with fresh provisions. We found the tortoises as fine as we had ever seen, and the ducks surpassed our best species of wild fowl, being exceedingly tender, juicy, and well flavored. Besides these, the savages brought us, upon our making them comprehend our wishes, a vast quantity of brown celery and scurvy grass, with a canoe load of fresh fish and some dried. The celery was a treat indeed, and the scurvy grass proved an incalculable benefit to restoring those of our men who had shown symptoms of disease. In a very short time, we had not a single person on the sick list. We had also plenty of other kinds of fresh provisions, among which may be mentioned a species of shellfish resembling the mussel in shape, but with the taste of an oyster. Shrimps, too, and prawns were abundant, and albatross and other birds' eggs with dark shells. We took in, too, a plentiful stock of the flesh of the hog, which I have mentioned before. Most of the men found it a palatable food, but I thought it was fishy and otherwise disagreeable. In return for these good things, we presented the natives with blue beads, brass trinkets, nails, knives, and pieces of red cloth, they being fully delighted in the exchange. We established a regular market on shore, just under the guns of the schooner, where our barterings were carried on with every appearance of good faith and a degree of order which their conduct at the village of Clocklock had not led us to expect from the savages. Matters went on thus very amicably for several days, during which parties of the natives were frequently on board the schooner, and parties of our men frequently on shore, making long excursions into the interior and receiving no molestation whatever. Finding the ease with which the vessel might be loaded with biche de mer, owing to the friendly disposition of the islanders and the readiness with which they would render us assistance in collecting it, Captain Guy resolved to enter into negotiations with Too Wit for the erection of suitable houses in which to cure the article, and for the services of himself and tribe in gathering as much as possible, while he himself took advantage of the fine weather to prosecute his voyage to the southward. Upon mentioning this project to the chief, he seemed very willing to enter into an agreement. A bargain was accordingly struck, perfectly satisfactory to both parties, by which it was arranged that, after making the necessary preparations, such as laying off the proper grounds, erecting a portion of the buildings, and doing some other work in which the whole of our crew would be required, the schooner should proceed on her route, leaving 3 of her men on the island to superintend the fulfillment of the project and instruct the natives in drying the biche de mer. In regard to terms, these were made to depend upon the exertions of the savages in our absence. They were to receive a stipulated quantity of blue beads, knives, red cloth, and so forth, for every certain number of piculs of the biche de mer which should be ready on our return. A description of the nature of this important article of commerce and the method of preparing it may prove of some interest to my readers, and I can find no more suitable place than this for introducing an account of it. The following comprehensive notice of the substance is taken from a modern history of a voyage to the South Seas. It is that mollusca from the Indian seas which is known to commerce by the French name bouche de mer, a nice morsel from the sea. If I am not much mistaken, the celebrated Cuvier calls it Gasteropeda pulmonifera. It is abundantly gathered in the coasts of the Pacific Islands, and gathered especially for the Chinese market, where it commands a great price, perhaps as much as their much talked of edible birds' nests, which are properly made up of the gelatinous matter picked up by a species of swallow from the body of these molluscae. They have no shell, no legs, nor any prominent part except an absorbing and an excretory opposite organs. But by their elastic wings, like caterpillars or worms, they creep in shallow waters, in which, when low, they can be seen by a kind of swallow, the sharp bill of which, inserted in the soft animal, draws a gummy and filamentous substance, which, by drying, can be brought into the solid walls of their nest. Hence the name of Gasteropeda, pulmonifera. This mollusca is oblong and of different sizes, from 3 to 18 inches in length, and I have seen a few that were not less than 2 feet long. They were nearly round, a little flattish on one side, which lies next to the bottom of the sea, and they are from 1 to 8 inches thick. They crawl up into shallow water at particular seasons of the year, probably for the purpose of gendering, as we often find them in pairs. It is when the sun has the most power on the water, rendering it tepid, that they approach the shore, and they often go up into places so shallow that on the tides receding they are left dry, exposed to the heat of the sun. But they do not bring forth their young in shallow water, as we never see any of their progeny, and full-grown ones are always observed coming in from deep water. They feed principally on that class of zoophytes which produce the coral. The biche de mer is generally taken in 3 or 4 feet of water, after which they are brought on shore and split at one end with a knife, the incision being 1 inch or more, according to the size of the mollusca. Through this opening, the entrails are forced out by pressure, and they are much like those of any other small tenant of the deep. The article is then washed and afterward boiled to a certain degree, which must not be too much or too little. They are then buried in the ground for 4 hours, then boiled again for a short time, after which they are dried either by the fire or the sun. Those cured by the sun are worth the most, but where 1 picule, 133 1/3 pounds, can be cured that way, I can cure 30 picules by the fire. When once properly cured, they can be kept in a dry place for 2 or 3 years without any risk, but they should be examined once in every few months, say 4 times a year, to see if any dampness is likely to affect them. The Chinese, as before stated, consider biche de mer a very great luxury, believing that it wonderfully strengthens and nourishes the system, and renews the exhausted system of the immoderate voluptuary. The first quality commands a high price in Canton, being worth $90 a picule. The second quality, $75, the third, $50, the fourth, $30, the fifth, $20, the sixth, $12, the seventh, $8, and the eighth, $4. Small cargoes, however, will often bring more in Manila, Singapore, and Batavia. An agreement having been thus entered into, we proceeded immediately to land everything necessary for preparing the buildings and clearing the ground. A large flat space near the eastern shore of the bay was selected, where there was plenty of both wood and water, and within a convenient distance of the principal reefs on which the biche de mer was to be procured. We now all set to work in good earnest, and soon, to the great astonishment of the savages, had felled a sufficient number of trees for our purpose, getting them quickly in order for the framework of the houses, which in 2 or 3 days were so far under way that we could safely trust the rest of the work to the 3 men whom we intended to leave behind. These were John Carson, Alfred Harris, Peterson, all natives of London, I believe, who volunteered their services in this respect. By the last of the month, we had everything in readiness for departure. We had agreed, however, to pay a formal visit of leave-taking to the village, and Too-wit insisted so pertinaciously upon our keeping the promise that we did not think it advisable to run the risk of offending him by a final refusal. I believe that not one of us had at this time the slightest suspicion of the good faith of the savages. They had uniformly behaved with the greatest decorum, aiding us with alacrity in our work, offering up their commodities frequently without price, and never, in any instance, pilfering a single article, although the high value they set upon the goods we had with us was evident by the extravagant demonstrations of joy always manifested upon our making them a present. The women especially were most obliging in every respect, and upon the whole we should have been the most suspicious of human beings, had we entertained a single thought of perfidy on the part of a people who treated us so well. A very short while sufficed to prove that this apparent kindness of disposition was only the result of a deeply laid plan for our destruction, and that the islanders, for whom we entertained such inordinate feelings of esteem, were among the most barbarous, subtle, and bloodthirsty wretches that ever contaminated the face of the globe. It was on the 1st of February that we went on shore for the purpose of visiting the village. Although, as said before, we entertained not the slightest suspicion, still no proper precaution was neglected. 6 men were left in the schooner, with instructions to permit none of the savages to approach the vessel during our absence, under any pretense whatever, and to remain constantly on deck. The boarding nettings were up, the guns double-shotted with grape and canister, and the swivels loaded with canisters of musket balls. She lay with her anchor apeak about a mile from the shore, and no canoe could approach her in any direction without being distinctly seen and exposed to the full fire of our swivels immediately. The 6 men being left on board, our shore party consisted of 32 persons in all. We were armed to the teeth, having with us muskets, pistols, and cutlasses. Besides, each had a long kind of seaman's knife, somewhat resembling the bowie knives now so much used throughout our western and southern country. 100 of the black-skinned warriors met us at the landing for the purpose of accompanying us on our way. We noticed, however, with some surprise, that they were now entirely without arms, and upon questioning Too-wit in relation to this circumstance, he merely answered that mate non we pas si, meaning that there was no need of arms, where all were brothers. We took this in good part, and proceeded. We had passed the spring and rivulet of which I before spoke, and were now entering upon a narrow gorge leading through the chain of soapstone hills among which the village was situated. This gorge was very rocky and uneven, so much so that it was with no little difficulty we scrambled through it on our first visit to Clock Clock. The whole length of the ravine might have been a mile and a half, or probably 2 miles. It wound in every possible direction through the hills, having apparently formed at some remote period the bed of a torrent. In no instance proceeding more than 20 yards without an abrupt turn. The sides of this dell would have averaged, I am sure, 70 or 80 feet in perpendicular attitude throughout the whole of their extent, and in some portions they rose to an astonishing height, overshadowing the pass so completely that but little of the light of day could penetrate. The general width was about 40 feet, and occasionally it diminished so as not to allow the passage of more than 5 or 6 persons abreast. In short, there could be no place in the world better adapted for the consummation of an ambuscade, and it was no more than natural that we should look carefully to our arms as we entered upon it. When I now think of our egregious folly, the chief subject of astonishment seems to be that we should have ever ventured under any circumstances so completely into the power of unknown savages as to permit them to march both before and behind us in our progress through this ravine. Yet such was the order we blindly took up, trusting foolishly to the force of our party, the unarmed condition of Too-wit and his men, the certain efficacy of our firearms, whose effect was yet a secret to the natives, and more than all, to the long-sustained pretension of friendship kept up by these infamous wretches. 5 or 6 of them went on before, as if to lead the way, ostentatiously busying themselves in removing the larger stones and rubbish from the path. Next came our own party. We walked closely together, taking care only to prevent separation. Behind followed the main body of the savages, observing unusual order and decorum. Dirk Peters, a man named Wilson Allan, and myself were on the right of our companions, examining as we went along the singular stratification of the precipice which overhung us. A fissure in the soft rock attracted our attention. It was about wide enough for one person to enter without squeezing, and extended back into the hill some 18 or 20 feet in a straight course, sloping afterward to the left. The height of the opening, as far as we could see into it from the main gorge, was perhaps 60 or 70 feet. There were 1 or 2 stunted shrubs growing from the crevices, bearing a species of filbert, which I felt some curiosity to examine, and pushed in briskly for that purpose, gathering 5 or 6 of the nuts at a grasp, and then hastily retreating. As I turned, I found that Peters and Allan had followed me. I desired them to go back, as there was not room for 2 persons to pass, saying they should have some of my nuts. They accordingly turned and were scrambling back, Allan being close to the mouth of the fissure, when I was suddenly aware of a concussion resembling nothing I had ever before experienced, and which impressed me with a vague conception, if indeed I then thought of anything, that the whole foundation of the solid globe were suddenly rent asunder, and the day of universal dissolution was at hand. Chapter 21. As soon as I could collect my scattered senses, I found myself nearly suffocated and groveling in utter darkness among a quantity of loose earth which was also falling upon me heavily in every direction, threatening to bury me entirely. Horribly alarmed at this idea, I struggled to gain my feet, and at last succeeded. I then remained motionless for some moments, endeavoring to conceive what had happened to me, and where I was. Presently I heard a deep groan just at my ear, and afterward the smothered voice of Peters calling to me for aid in the name of God. I scrambled 1 or 2 paces forward when I fell directly over the head and shoulders of my companion, who I soon discovered was buried in a loose mass of earth as far as his middle, and struggling desperately to free himself from the pressure. I tore the dirt from around him with all the energy I could command, and at length succeeded in getting him out. As soon as we sufficiently recovered from our fright and surprise to be capable of conversing rationally, we both came to the conclusion that the walls of the fissure in which we had ventured had, by some convulsion of nature, or probably from their own weight, caved in overhead, and that we were consequently lost forever, being thus entombed alive. For a long time we gave up supinely to the most intense agony and despair, such as cannot be adequately imagined by those who have never been in a similar position. I firmly believe that no incident ever occurring in the course of human events is more adapted to inspire this supremeness of mental and bodily distress than a case like our own of living inhumation. The blackness of darkness which envelops the victim, the terrific oppression of lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, unite with the ghastly considerations that we are beyond the remotest confines of hope, and that such is the allotted portion of the dead, to carry into the human heart a degree of appalling awe and horror not to be tolerated, never to be conceived. At length, Peters proposed that we should endeavor to ascertain precisely the extent of our calamity and grope about our prison. It being barely possible, he observed, that some opening might yet be left us for escape. I caught eagerly at this hope, and, arousing myself to exertion, attempted to force my way through the loose earth. Hardly had I advanced a single step before a glimmer of light became perceptible, enough to convince me that at all events we should not immediately perish for want of air. We now took some degree of heart, and encouraged each other to hope for the best. Having scrambled over a bank of rubbish which impeded our farther progress into the direction of the light, we found less difficulty in advancing, and also experienced some relief from the excessive oppression of lungs which had tormented us. Presently we were enabled to obtain a glimpse of the objects around, and discovered that we were near the extremity of the straight portion of the fissure, where it made a turn to the left. A few struggles more, and we reached the bend, when, to our inexpressible joy, there appeared a long seam or crack extending upward a vast distance, generally at an angle of about 45 degrees, although sometimes much more precipitous. We could not see through the whole extent of this opening, but as a good deal of light came down it, we had little doubt of finding at the top of it, if we could by any means reach the top, a clear passage into the open air. I now called to mind that 3 of us had entered the fissure from the main gorge, and that our companion Allan was still missing. We determined at once to retrace our steps and look for him. After a long search, and much danger from the farther caving in of the earth above us, Peters at length cried out to me that he had hold of our companion's foot, and that his whole body was deeply buried beneath the rubbish beyond the possibility of extricating him. I soon found that what he said was too true, and that, of course, life had been long extinct. With sorrowful hearts, therefore, we left the corpse to its fate, and again made our way to the bend. The breadth of the seam was barely sufficient to admit us, and after 1 or 2 ineffectual efforts at getting up, we began once more to despair. I have before said that the chain of hills through which ran the main gorge was composed of a species of soft rock, resembling soapstone. The sides of the cleft where we were now attempting to ascend were of the same material, and so excessively slippery, being wet, that we could get but little foothold upon them, even in their least precipitous parts. In some places, where the ascent was nearly perpendicular, the difficulty was of course much aggravated, and indeed for some time we thought insurmountable. We took courage, however, from despair, and what by dint of cutting steps in the soft stone with our bowie knives, and swinging at the risk of our lives, to small projecting points of a harder species of slaty rock which now and then protruded from the general mass, we at length reached a natural platform from which was perceptible a patch of blue sky at the extremity of a thickly wooded ravine. Looking back now, with somewhat more leisure, at the passage through which we had thus far proceeded, we clearly saw from the appearance of its sides that it was of late formation, and we concluded that the concussion, whatever it was, which had so unexpectedly overwhelmed us, had also at the same moment laid open this path for escape. Being quite exhausted with exertion, and indeed so weak that we were scarcely able to stand or articulate, Peters now proposed that we should endeavour to bring our companions to the rescue by firing the pistols which we still remained in our girdles. The muskets, as well as cutlasses, had been lost among the loose earth at the bottom of the chasm. Subsequent events proved that had we fired, we should have sorely repented it. But luckily a half suspicion of foul play had by this time arisen in my mind, and we forbore to let the savages know of our whereabouts. After having reposed for about an hour, we pushed on slowly up the ravine, and had gone no great way before we heard a succession of tremendous yells. At length we reached what might be called the surface of the ground, for our path hitherto, since leaving the platform, had lain beneath an archway of high rock and foliage at a vast distance overhead. With great caution we stole to our narrow opening, through which we had a clear sight of the surrounding country, when the whole dreadful secret of the concussion broke upon us in one moment and at one view. The spot from which we looked was not far from the summit of the highest peak in the range of the Soapstone Hills. The gorge in which our party of 32 had entered ran within 50 feet to the left of us. But for at least 100 yards the channel or bed of this gorge was entirely filled up with the chaotic ruins of more than 1,000,000 tons of earth and stone that had been artificially tumbled within it. The means by which the vast mass had been precipitated were not more simple than evident, for sure traces of the murderous work were yet remaining. In several spots along the top of the eastern side of the gorge, we were now on the western, might be seen stakes of wood driven into the earth. In these spots the earth had not given way, but throughout the whole extent of the face of the precipice from which the mass had fallen, it was clear from marks left in the soil resembling those made by the drill of the rock blaster, that stakes, similar to those we saw standing, had been inserted at not more than a yard apart, for the length of perhaps 300 feet, and ranging at about 10 feet back from the edge of the gulf. Strong cords of grapevine were attached to the stakes still remaining on the hill, and it was evident that such cords had also been attached to each of the other stakes. I've already spoken of the singular stratification of these soapstone hills, and the description just given of the narrow and deep fissure through which we effected our escape from inhumation will afford a further conception of its nature. This was such that almost every natural convulsion would be sure to split the soil into perpendicular layers or ridges running parallel with one another, and a very moderate exertion of art would be sufficient for effecting the same purpose. Of this stratification the savages had availed themselves to accomplish their treacherous ends. There can be no doubt that by the continuous line of stakes a partial rupture of the soil had been brought about, probably to the depth of 1 or 2 feet, when by means of a savage pulling at the end of each of the cords, these cords being attached to the top of the stakes and extending back from the edge of the cliff, a vast leverage of power was obtained, capable of hurling the whole face of the hill, upon a given signal, into the bosom of the abyss below. The fate of our poor companions was no longer a matter of uncertainty. We alone had escaped from the tempest of that overwhelming destruction. We were the only living white men upon the island. Chapter 22. Our situation, as it now appeared, was scarcely less dreadful than when we had conceived ourselves entombed forever. We saw before us no prospect but that of being put to death by the savages, or of dragging out a miserable existence in captivity among them. We might, to be sure, conceal ourselves for a time from their observation among the fastnesses of the hills, and as a final resort in the chasm from which we had just issued. But we must either perish in the long polar winter through cold and famine, or be ultimately discovered in our efforts to obtain relief. The whole country around us seemed to be swarming with savages, crowds of whom we now perceived had come over from the islands to the southward on flat rafts, doubtless with a view of lending their aid in the capture and plunder of the Jane. The vessel still lay calmly at anchor in the bay, those on board being apparently quite unconscious of any danger awaiting them. How we longed at that moment to be with them, either to aid in effecting their escape, or to perish with them in attempting a defense! We saw no chance even of warning them of their danger without bringing immediate destruction upon our own heads, with but a remote hope of benefit to them. A pistol fired might suffice to apprise them that something wrong had occurred, but the report could not possibly inform them that their only prospect of safety lay in getting out of the harbor forthwith, nor tell them no principles of honor now bound them to remain, that their companions were no longer among the living. Upon hearing the discharge, they could not be more thoroughly prepared to meet the foe, who were now getting ready to attack, than they already were, and always had been. No good, therefore, and infinite harm would result from our firing, and after mature deliberation we forbore. Our next thought was to attempt to rush toward the vessel, to seize one of the 4 canoes which lay at the head of the bay, and endeavor to force a passage on board. But the utter impossibility of succeeding in this desperate task soon became evident. The country, as I said before, was literally swarming with the natives, skulking among the bushes and recesses of the hills, so as not to be observed from the schooner. In our immediate vicinity especially, and blockading the sole path by which we could hope to attain the shore at the proper point, was stationed the whole party of the black-skinned warriors, with Too-Wit at their head, and apparently only waiting for some reinforcement to commence his onset upon the Jane. The canoes, too, which lay at the head of the bay, were manned with savages, unarmed, it is true, but who undoubtedly had arms within reach. We were forced, therefore, however, and unwillingly, to remain in our place of concealment, mere spectators of the conflict which presently ensued. In about half an hour we saw some 60 or 70 rafts or flatboats with outriggers, filled with savages, and coming round the southern bight of the harbor. They appeared to have no arms except short clubs and stones which lay in the bottom of the rafts. Immediately afterward, another detachment, still larger, appeared in an opposite direction and with similar weapons. The 4 canoes, too, were now quickly filled with natives, starting up from the bushes at the head of the bay, and put off swiftly to join the other parties. Thus, in less time than I have taken to tell it, as if by magic, the Jane suddenly saw herself surrounded by an immense multitude of desperadoes, evidently bent upon capturing her at all hazards. That they would succeed in so doing could not be doubted for an instant. The 6 men left in the vessel, however resolutely they might engage in her defense, were altogether unequal to the proper management of the guns, or in any manner to sustain a contest at such odds. I could hardly imagine that they would make resistance at all. But in this was deceived, for presently I saw them get springs upon the cable and bring the vessel's starboard broadside to bear upon the canoes, which by this time were within pistol range, the rafts being nearly a quarter of a mile to windward. Owing to some cause unknown, but most probably to the agitation of our poor friends at seeing themselves in so hopeless a situation, the discharge was an entire failure. Not a canoe was hit, or a single savage injured, the shots striking short and ricocheting over their heads. The only effect produced upon them was astonishment at the unexpected report and smoke, which was so excessive that for some moments I almost thought that they would abandon their design entirely and return to the shore. And this they would most likely have done, had our men followed up their broadside by a discharge of small arms, in which, as the canoes were now so near at hand, they could not have failed in doing some execution sufficient at least to deter this party from a farther advance, until they could have given the rafts also a broadside. But in place of this, they left the canoe party to recover from their panic, and by looking about them to see that no injury had been sustained, while they flew to the larboard to get ready for the rafts. The discharge to larboard produced the most terrible effect. The star and double-headed shot of the large guns cut 7 or 8 of the rafts completely asunder, and killed perhaps 30 or 40 of the savages outright, while 100 of them, at least, were thrown into the water, and the most of them dreadfully wounded. The remainder, frightened out of their senses, commenced at once a precipitate retreat, not even waiting to pick up their maimed companions, who were swimming about in every direction, screaming and yelling for aid. This great success, however, came too late for the salvation of our devoted people. The canoe party were already on board the schooner, to the number of more than 150, the most of them having succeeded in scrambling up the chains and over the boarding netting even before the matches had been applied to the larboard guns. Nothing now could withstand their brute rage. Our men were borne down at once, overwhelmed, trodden underfoot, and absolutely torn to pieces in an instant. Seeing this, the savages on the rafts got the better of their fears and came up in shoals to the plunder. In 5 minutes, the Jane was a pitiable scene indeed of havoc and tumultuous outrage. The decks were split open and ripped up, the cordage, sails, and everything movable on deck demolished as if by magic, while by dint of pushing at the stern, towing with the canoes, and hauling at the sides, as they swam in thousands around the vessel, the wretches finally forced her on shore, the cable having been slipped, and delivered her over to the good offices of Too-Wit, who during the whole of this engagement had maintained, like a skilful general, his post of security and reconnaissance among the hills, but now, that the victory was completed to his satisfaction, condescended to scamper down with his warriors of the black skin and become a partaker in the spoils. Too-Wit's descent left us at liberty to quit our hiding place and reconnoitre the hill in the vicinity of the chasm. At about 50 yards from the mouth of it, we saw a small spring of water, in which we slaked the burning thirst that now consumed us. Not far from the spring, we discovered several of the filbert bushes which I mentioned before. Upon tasting the nuts, we found them palatable and very nearly resembling in flavour the common English filbert. We collected our hats full immediately, deposited them within the ravine, and returned for more. While we were busily employed in gathering these, a rustling in the bushes alarmed us, and we were upon the point of stealing back to our covert, when a large black bird of the bittern species, strugglingly and slowly, arose above the shrubs. I was so much startled that I could do nothing, but Peters had sufficient presence of mind to run up to it before it could make its escape and seize it by the neck. Its struggles and screams were tremendous, and we had thoughts of letting it go, lest the noise should alarm some of the savages who might still be lurking in the neighborhood. A stab with a bowie knife, however, at length brought it to the ground, and we dragged it into the ravine, congratulating ourselves that, at all events, we had thus obtained a supply of food enough to last us for a week. We now went out again to look about us, and ventured a considerable distance down the southern declivity of the hill, but met with nothing else which could serve us for food. We therefore collected a quantity of dry wood and returned, seeing 1 or 2 large parties of the natives on their way to the village, laden with the plunder of the vessel, and we were apprehensive might discover us in passing beneath the hill. Our next care was to render our place of concealment as secure as possible, and with this object we arranged some brushwood over the aperture which I have before spoken of as the one through which we saw the patch of blue sky on reaching the platform from the interior of the chasm. We left only a very small opening, just wide enough to admit of our seeing the bay without the risk of being discovered from below. Having done this, we congratulated ourselves upon the security of the position, for we were now completely excluded from observation, as long as we chose to remain within the ravine itself and not venture out upon the hill. We could perceive no traces of the savages having ever been within this hollow, but indeed, when we came to reflect upon the probability that the fissure through which we had attained it had been only just now created by the fall of the cliff opposite, and that no other way of attaining it could be perceived, we were not so much rejoiced at the thought of being secure from molestation as fearful lest there should be absolutely no means left for us for descent. We resolved to explore the summit of the hill thoroughly when a good opportunity should offer. In the meantime, we watched the motions of the savages through our loophole. They had already made a complete wreck of the vessel, and were now preparing to set her on fire. In a little while we saw the smoke ascending in huge volumes from her main hatchway, and shortly afterward a dense mass of flame burst up from the forecastle. The rigging, masts, and what remained of the sails caught immediately, and the fire spread rapidly along the decks. Still a great many of the savages retained their stations about her, hammering with large stones, axes, and cannon balls at the bolts and other iron and copper work. On the beach and in canoes and rafts, there were not less altogether in the immediate vicinity of the schooner than 10,000 natives, besides the shoals of them who, laden with booty, were making their way inland and over to the neighboring islands. We now anticipated a catastrophe, and were not disappointed. First of all, there came a smart shock, which we felt as distinctly where we were as if we'd been slightly galvanized. But unattended with any visible signs of an explosion, the savages were evidently startled, and paused for an instant from their labors and yellings. They were upon the point of recommencing, when suddenly a mass of smoke puffed up from the decks, resembling a black and heavy thundercloud. Then, as if from its bowels, arose a tall stream of vivid fire to the height, apparently, of a quarter of a mile. Then there came a sudden circular expansion of the flame, and the whole atmosphere was magically crowded in a single instant with a wild chaos of wood and metal and human limbs. And lastly came the concussion in its fullest fury, which hurled us impetuously from our feet, while the hills echoed and re-echoed the tumult, and a dense shower of the minutest fragments of the ruins tumbled headlong in every direction around us. The havoc among the savages far exceeded our utmost expectation, and they had now indeed reaped the full and perfect fruits of their treachery. Perhaps 1,000 perished by the explosion, while at least an equal number were desperately mangled. The whole surface of the bay was literally strewn with the struggling and drowning wretches, and on shore matters were even worse. They seemed utterly appalled by the suddenness and completeness of their discomfiture, and made no efforts at assisting one another. At length we observed a total change in their demeanour. From absolute stupor they appeared to be all at once aroused to the highest pitch of excitement, and rushed wildly about, going to and from a certain point on the beach. The strangest expressions of mingled horror, rage, and intense curiosity depicted on their countenances, and shouting at the top of their voices, "Tekeli Li! Tekeli Li!" Presently we saw a large body go off into the hills, whence they returned in a short time, carrying stakes of wood. These they brought to the station where the crowd was the thickest, which now separated so as to afford us a view of the object of all this excitement. We perceived something white lying upon the ground, but could not immediately make out what it was. At length we saw that it was the carcass of the strange animal with the scarlet teeth and claws which the schooner had picked up at sea on the 18th of January. Captain Guy had had the body preserved for the purpose of stuffing the skin and taking it to England. I remember he had given some directions about it just before our making the island, and it had been brought into the cabin and stowed away in one of the lockers. It had now been thrown on shore by the explosion, but why it had occasioned so much concern among the savages was more than we could comprehend. Although they crowded around the carcass at a little distance, none of them seemed willing to approach it closely. By and by the men with the stakes drove them in a circle around it, and no sooner was this arrangement completed than the whole of the vast assemblage rushed into the interior of the island with loud screams of "Tekeli Li! Tekeli Li!" Chapter 23. During the 6 or 7 days immediately following, we remained in our hiding place upon the hill, going out only occasionally, and then with the greatest precaution, for water and filberts. We had made a kind of penthouse on the platform, furnishing it with a bed of dry leaves, and placing in it three large flat stones, which served us for both fireplace and table. We kindled a fire without difficulty by rubbing 2 pieces of dry wood together, the one soft, the other hard. The bird we had taken in such good season proved excellent eating, although somewhat tough. It was not an oceanic fowl, but a species of bittern, with jet black and grisly plumage, and diminutive wings in proportion to its bulk. We afterwards saw 3 of the same kind in the vicinity of the ravine, apparently seeking for the one we had captured, but as they never alighted, we had no opportunity of catching them. As long as this fowl lasted, we suffered nothing from our situation, but It was now entirely consumed, and it became absolutely necessary that we should look out for provisions. The filberts would not satisfy the cravings of hunger, afflicting us too with severe gripings of the bowels, and, if freely indulged in, with violent headaches. We had seen several large tortoises near the seashore to the eastward of the hill, and perceived they might be easily taken, if we could get at them without the observation of the natives. It was resolved, therefore, to make an attempt at descending. We commenced by going down the southern declivity, which seemed to offer the fewest difficulties, but had not proceeded 100 yards before, as we had anticipated from appearances on the hilltop, our progress was entirely arrested by a branch of the gorge in which our companions had perished. We now passed along the edge of this for about a quarter of a mile, when we were again stopped by a precipice of immense depth, and not being able to make our way along the brink of it, we were forced to retrace our steps by the main ravine. We now pushed over to the eastward, but with precisely similar fortune. After an hour's scramble, at the risk of breaking our necks, we discovered that we had merely descended into a vast pit of black granite with fine dust at the bottom, and whence the only egress was by the rugged path in which we had come down. Toiling again up this path, we now tried the northern edge of the hill. Here we were obliged to use the greatest possible caution in our manoeuvres, as the least indiscretion would expose us to the full view of the savages in the village. We crawled along, therefore, on our hands and knees, and occasionally were even forced to throw ourselves at full length, dragging our bodies along by means of the shrubbery. In this careful manner we had proceeded but a little way, when we arrived at a chasm far deeper than any we had yet seen, and leading directly into the main gorge. Thus our fears were fully confirmed, and we found ourselves cut off entirely from access to the world below. Thoroughly exhausted by our exertions, we made the best of our way back to the platform, and throwing ourselves upon the bed of leaves, slept sweetly and soundly for some hours. For several days after this fruitless search, we were occupied in exploring every part of the summit of the hill in order to inform ourselves of its actual resources. We found that it would afford us no food, with the exception of the unwholesome filberts and a rank species of scurvy grass, which grew in little patch not more than 4 rods square, and would be soon exhausted. On the 15th of February, as near as I can remember, there was not a blade of this left, and the nuts were growing scarce. Our situation, therefore, could hardly be more lamentable. There's a little footnote here. This day was rendered remarkable by our observing in the south several huge wreaths of the greyish vapour I have spoken of. On the 16th, we again went round the wall of our prison in hope of finding some avenue of escape, but to no purpose. We also descended the chasm, in which we had been overwhelmed with a faint expectation of discovering through this channel some opening to the main ravine. Here, too, we were disappointed, although we found and brought up with us a musket. On the 17th, we set out with the determination of examining more thoroughly the chasm of black granite into which we had made our way in the first search. We remembered that one of the fissures in the side of this pit had been but partially looked into, and we were anxious to explore it, although with no expectation of discovering here any opening. We found no great difficulty in reaching the bottom of the hollow as before, and were now sufficiently calm to survey it with some attention. It was indeed one of the most singular-looking places imaginable, and we could scarcely bring ourselves to believe it altogether the work of nature. The pit, from its eastern to its western extremity, was about 500 yards in length, when all its windings were threaded. The distance from east to west in a straight line not being more, I should suppose, having no means of accurate examination, than 40 or 50 yards. Upon first descending into the chasm, that is to say, for 100 feet downward from the summit of the hill, the sides of the abyss bore little resemblance to each other, and apparently had at no time been connected, the one surface being of the soapstone, the other of marl, granulated with some metallic matter. The average breadth or interval between the two cliffs was probably here 60 feet, but there seemed to be no regularity of formation. Passing down, however, beyond the limit spoken of, the interval rapidly contracted, and the sides began to run parallel, although for some distance farther they were still dissimilar in their material and form of surface. Upon arriving within 50 feet of the bottom, a perfect regularity commenced. The sides were now entirely uniform in substance, in color, and in lateral direction, the material being a very black and shining granite, and the distance between the two sides, at all points facing each other, exactly 20 yards. The precise formation of the chasm will be best understood by means of a delineation taken upon the spot, for I had luckily with me a pocket-book and pencil, which I preserved with great care through a long series of subsequent adventure, and to which I am indebted for memoranda of many subjects which would otherwise have been crowded from my remembrance. This figure, see figure 1, gives the general outline of the chasm, without the minor cavities in the sides, of which there were several, each cavity having a corresponding protuberance opposite. The bottom of the gulf was covered to the depth of 3 or 4 inches with a powder almost impalpable, beneath which we found a continuation of the black granite. To the right, at the lower extremity, will be noticed the appearance of a small opening. This is the fissure alluded to above, and to examine which more minutely than before was the object of our second visit. We now pushed into it with vigor, cutting away a quantity of brambles which impeded us, and removing a vast heap of sharp flints, somewhat resembling arrowheads in shape. We were encouraged to persevere, however, by perceiving some little light proceeding from the farther end. We at length squeezed our way for about 30 feet, and found that the aperture was a low and regularly formed arch, having a bottom of the same impalpable powder as that in the main chasm. A strong light now broke upon us, and turning a short bend, we found ourselves in another lofty chamber, similar to the one we had left in every respect but longitudinal form. In general, its general figure is given here. See figure 2. The total length of this chasm, commencing at the opening A and proceeding round the curve B to the extremity D, is 550 yards. At C, we discovered a small aperture similar to the one through which we had issued from the other chasm, and this was choked up in the same manner with brambles and a quantity of the white arrowhead flints. We forced our way through it, finding it about 40 feet long, and emerged into a third chasm. This too was precisely like the first, except in its longitudinal shape, which was thus. See figure 3. There we are. Figure 3. We found the entire length of the third chasm 320 yards. At the point A was an opening about 6 feet wide, and it extended 15 feet into the rock, where it terminated in a bed of marl, there being no other chasm beyond, as we had expected. We were about leaving this fissure, into which very little light was admitted, when Peters called my attention to a range of singular-looking indentures in the surface of the marl, forming the termination of the cul-de-sac. The very slight exertion of the imagination, the left or most northern of these indentures might have been taken for the intentional, although rude, representation of a human figure, standing erect and with outstretched arm. The rest of them bore also some little resemblance to alphabetical characters, and Peters was willing, at all events, to adopt the idle opinion that they were really such. I convinced him of his error, finally, by directing his attention to the floor of the fissure, where, among the powder, we picked up, piece by piece, several large flakes of the marl, which had evidently broken off by some convulsion from the surface where the indentures were found, and which had projecting points exactly fitting the indentures, thus proving them to have been the work of nature. Figure 4 presents an accurate copy of the whole. After satisfying ourselves that these singular caverns afforded us no means of escape from our prison, we made our way back, dejected and dispirited, to the summit of the hill. Nothing worth mentioning occurred during the next 24 hours, except that in examining the ground to the eastward of the third chasm, we found 2 triangular holes of great depth, and also with black granite sides. Into these holes we did not think it worth while to attempt descending, as they had the appearance of mere natural wells without outlet. They were each about 20 yards in circumference, and their shape as well as relative position in regard to the third chasm is shown in Figure 5. Chapter 24. On the 20th of the month, finding it altogether impossible to subsist any longer upon the filberts, the use of which occasioned us the most excruciating torment, we resolved to make a desperate attempt at descending the southern declivity of the hill. The face of the precipice was here of the softest species of soapstone, although nearly perpendicular throughout its whole extent, a depth of 150 feet at the least, and in many places even overarching. After long search, we discovered a narrow ledge about 20 feet below the brink of the gulf. Upon this Peters contrived to leap, with what assistance I could render him by means of our pocket handkerchiefs tied together. With somewhat more difficulty I also got down, and we then saw the possibility of descending the whole way by the process in which we had clambered up from the chasm, when we had been buried by the fall of the hill, that is, by cutting steps in the face of the soapstone with our knives. The extreme hazard of the attempt can scarcely be conceived, but as there was no other resource, we determined to undertake it. Upon the ledge where we stood there grew some filbert bushes, and to one of these we made fast an end of our rope of handkerchiefs, the other end being tied round Peter's waist. I lowered him down over the edge of the precipice until the handkerchiefs were stretched tight. He now proceeded to dig a deep hole in the soapstone, as far in as 8 or 10 inches, sloping away the rock above to the height of a foot or thereabout, so as to allow of his driving with the butt of a pistol a tolerably strong peg into the levelled surface. I then drew him up for about 4 feet, when he made a hole similar to the one below, driving in a peg as before, and having thus a resting place for both feet and hands. I now unfastened the handkerchiefs from the bush, throwing him the end, which he tied to the peg in the uppermost hole, letting himself down gently to a station about 3 feet lower than he had yet been, that is, to the full extent of the handkerchiefs. Here he dug another hole and drove another peg. He then drew himself up so as to rest his feet in the hole just cut, taking hold with his hands upon the peg in the one above. It was now necessary to untie the handkerchiefs from the topmost peg, with a view of fastening them to the second. And here he found that an error had been committed in cutting the holes at so great a distance apart. However, after 1 or 2 unsuccessful and dangerous attempts at reaching the knot, having to hold on with his left hand while he labored to undo the fastening with his right, he at length cut the string, leaving 6 inches of it affixed to the peg. Tying the handkerchiefs now to the second peg, he descended to a station below the third, taking care not to go too far down. By these means which I should never have conceived of myself, and for which we were indebted altogether to Peters's ingenuity and resolution, my companion finally succeeded, with the occasional aid of projections in the cliff, in reaching the bottom without accident. It was some time before I could summon sufficient resolution to follow him, but I did at length attempt it. Peters had taken off his shirt before descending, and this, with my own, formed the rope necessary for the adventure. After throwing down the musket found in the chasm, I fastened this rope to the bushes and let myself down rapidly, striving by the vigor of my movements to banish the trepidation which I could overcome in no other manner. This answered sufficiently well for the first 4 or 5 steps, but presently I found my imagination growing terribly excited by the thoughts of the vast depths yet to be descended, and the precarious nature of the pegs and soapstone holes which were my only support. It was in vain I endeavored to banish these reflections, and to keep my eyes steadily bent upon the flat surface of the cliff before me. The more earnestly I struggled not to think, the more intensely vivid became my conceptions, and the more horribly distinct. At length arrived that crisis of fancy so fearful in all similar cases, the crisis in which we begin to anticipate the feelings with which we shall fall, to picture to ourselves the sickness and the dizziness and the last struggle and the half swoon and the final bitterness of the rushing and headlong descent. And now I found these fancies creating their own realities and a whole imagined horrors crowding upon me in fact. I felt my knees strike violently together while my fingers were gradually but certainly relaxing their grasp. There was a ringing in my ears, and I said, "This is my knell of death." And now I was consumed with the irrepressible desire of looking below. I would not confine my glances to the cliff, and with a wild, indefinable emotion, half of horror, half of a relieved oppression, I threw my vision far down into the abyss. For one moment, my fingers clutched convulsively upon their hold, while with a movement the faintest possible idea of ultimate escape wandered like a shadow through my mind. In the next, my whole soul was pervaded with a longing to fall, a desire, a yearning, a passion utterly uncontrollable. I let go at once my grasp on the peg, and turning half round from the precipice, remained tottering for an instant against its naked face. But now there came a spinning of the brain, a shrill-sounding and phantom voice screamed within my ears. A dusky, fiendish and filmy figure stood immediately beneath me, and sighing, I sunk down with a bursting heart and plunged within its arms. I'd swooned, and Peters had caught me as I fell. He had observed my proceedings from his station at the bottom of the cliff, and perceiving my imminent danger, had endeavored to inspire me with courage by every suggestion he could devise, although my confusion of mind had been so great as to prevent my hearing what he said, or being conscious that he had ever spoken to me at all. At length, seeing me totter, he hastened to ascend to my rescue, and arrived just in time for my preservation. Had I fallen with my full weight, the rope of linen would inevitably have snapped, and I should have been precipitated into the abyss. As it was, he contrived to let me down gently, so as to remain suspended, without danger, until animation returned. This was in about 15 minutes. On recovery, my trepidation had entirely vanished. I felt a new being, and with some little further aid from my companion, reached the bottom, also, in safety. We now found ourselves not far from the ravine which had proved the tomb of our friends, and to the southward of the spot where the hill had fallen. The place was one of singular wildness, and its aspect brought to my mind the description given by travellers of those dreary regions marking the site of degraded Babylon, not to speak of the ruins of the disrupted cliff, which formed a chaotic barrier in the vista to the northward. The surface of the ground in every other direction was strewn with huge tumuli, apparently the wreck of some gigantic structures of art, although in detail no semblance of art could be detected. Scoria were abundant, and large shapeless blocks of the black granite intermingled with others of marl. There's a footnote here. The marl was also black. Indeed, we noticed no light-coloured substances of any kind upon the island, and both granulated with metal. Of vegetation there were no traces whatsoever throughout the whole of the desolate area within sight. Several immense scorpions were seen, and various reptiles not elsewhere to be found in the high latitudes. As food was our most immediate object, we resolved to make our way to the sea-coast, distant not more than half a mile, with a view of catching turtle, several of which we had observed from our place of concealment on the hill. We proceeded some 100 yards, threading our route cautiously between the huge rocks and tumuli, when, upon turning the corner, 5 savages sprung upon us from a small cavern, felling Peters to the ground with a blow from a club. As he fell, the whole party rushed upon him to secure their victim, leaving me time to recover from my astonishment. I still had the musket, but the barrel had received so much injury in being thrown from the precipice that I cast it aside as useless, preferring to trust my pistols, which had been carefully preserved in order. With these I advanced upon the assailants, firing one after the other in quick succession. 2 savages fell, and one, who was in the act of thrusting a spear into Peters, sprung to his feet without accomplishing his purpose. My companion being thus released, we had no further difficulty. He had his pistols also, but prudently declined using them, confiding in his great personal strength, which far exceeded that of any person I have ever known. Seizing a club from one of the savages who had fallen, he dashed out the brains of the three who remained, killing each instantaneously with a single blow of the weapon, and leaving us completely masters of the field. So rapidly had these events passed that we could scarcely believe in their reality, and were standing over the bodies of the dead in a species of stupid contemplation, when we were brought to recollection by the sound of shouts in the distance. It was clear that the savages had been alarmed by the firing, and that we had little chance of avoiding discovery. To regain the cliff, it would be necessary to proceed in the direction of the shouts, and even should we succeed in arriving at its base, we should never be able to ascend it without being seen. Our situation was one of the greatest peril, and we were hesitating in which path to commence a flight, when one of the savages whom I had shot and supposed dead sprang briskly to his feet and attempted to make his escape. We overtook him, however, before he had advanced many paces, and were about to put him to death, when Peter suggested that we might derive some benefit from forcing him to accompany us in our attempt to escape. We therefore dragged him with us, making him understand that we would shoot him if he offered resistance. In a few minutes he was perfectly submissive, and ran by our sides as we pushed in among the rocks, making for the seashore. So far, the irregularities of the ground we had been traversing hid the sea, except at intervals, from our sight, and when we first had it fairly in view it was perhaps 200 yards distant. As we emerged into the open beach, we saw to our great dismay an immense crowd of the natives pouring from the village, and from all visible quarters of the island, making towards us with gesticulations of extreme fury, and howling like wild beasts. We were upon the point of turning upon our steps, and trying to secure a retreat among the fastnesses of the rougher ground, when I discovered the bows of two canoes projecting from behind a large rock which ran out of the water. Towards these we now ran with all speed, and reaching them found them unguarded and without any other freight than 3 of the large Galapagos turtles and the usual supply of paddles for 60 rowers. We instantly took possession of one of them, and forcing our captive on board, pushed out to sea with all the strength we could command. We had not made, however, more than 50 yards from the shore before we became sufficiently calm to perceive the great oversight of which we had been guilty in leaving the other canoe in the power of the savages, who by this time were not more than twice as far from the beach as ourselves, and were rapidly advancing to the pursuit. No time was now to be lost. Our hope was at best a forlorn one, but we had none other. It was very doubtful whether with the utmost exertion we could get back in time to anticipate them in taking possession of the canoe, but yet there was a chance that we could. We might save ourselves if we succeeded, while not to make the attempt was to resign ourselves to inevitable butchery. The canoe was modelled with the bow and stern alike. In place of turning it round, we merely changed our positions in paddling. As soon as the savages perceived this, they redoubled their yells as well as their speed, and approached with inconceivable rapidity. We pulled, however, with all the energy of desperation, and arrived at the contested point before more than one of the natives had attained it. This man paid dearly for his superior agility, Peters shooting him through the head with a pistol as he approached the shore. The foremost among the rest of his party were probably some 20 or 30 paces distant. As we seized upon the canoe, we at first endeavored to pull her into the deep water beyond the reach of the savages, but finding her too firmly aground, and there being no time to spare, Peters, with 1 or 2 heavy strokes from the butt of the musket, succeeded in dashing out a large portion of the bow and of one side. We then pushed off. 2 of the natives by this time had got hold of our boat, obstinately refusing to let go, until we were forced to dispatch them with our knives. We were now clear off and making great way out to sea. The main body of the savages, upon reaching the broken canoe, set up the most tremendous yell of rage and disappointment conceivable. In truth, from everything I could see of these wretches, they appeared to be the most wicked, hypocritical, vindictive, bloodthirsty, and altogether fiendish race of men upon the face of the globe. It is clear we should have had no mercy had we fallen into their hands. They made a mad attempt at following us in the fractured canoe, but finding it useless, again vented their rage in a series of hideous vociferations and rushed up into the hills. We were thus relieved from immediate danger, but our situation was still sufficiently gloomy. We knew that 4 canoes of the kind we were at one time we knew that 4 canoes of the kind we had were at one time in the possession of the savages, and were not aware of the fact, afterward ascertained from our captive, that 2 of these had been blown to pieces in the explosion of the Jane Guy, We calculated, therefore, upon being yet pursued as soon as our enemies could get round to the bay, distant about 3 miles, where the boats were usually laid up. Fearing this, we made every exertion to leave the island behind us, and went rapidly through the water, forcing the prisoner to take a paddle. In about half an hour, when we had gained probably 5 or 6 miles to the southward, a large fleet of the flat-bottomed canoes or rafts were seen to emerge from the bay, evidently with the design of pursuit. Presently they put back, despairing to overtake us.